The topic of this presentation is how the postcolonial theory on British Imperial India helps to understand the postcolonial experience of India. As you can see on the map and may already know, India is located in the south of Asia below China and Nepal. So how and why was India colonised? To fully understand the postcolonial theory on British Imperial India, how and why India was colonised by England is an important foundation. While India was colonised by many strong European powers such as the British, the Dutch, the Danish, the French, and the Portuguese, for this presentation on postcolonial theory, the colonisation of India by the British will be the focus. So how was India colonised? Most countries were colonised through territorial invasion, occupation, or exploitation of inhabited lands. In regards to India, it was already colonised through occupation, which later became a territorial invasion for the purpose of expansion. Until India, England was heavily reliant on its trade with Europe. However, trade with the Indies would open many doors and later lead to trade with the Americas. While India was primarily colonised for trade purposes, there was still the aspect of civilising the uncivilised. While the English were less ruthless and fanatical than the Spanish in their determination to Christianise and civilise newly discovered territories, they were increasingly anxious to export aspects of their own culture. In saying that, the civilisation of India was not the main reason for colonisation. The original intent of Queen Elizabeth I in trading with the East Indies was to gain increasingly needed income. Instead, it led to lay foundations for the magnificent imperial structure of the British Raj, otherwise known as the British Crown. When England began its trade with India, the Dutch were still in control. Originally, the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company coexisted sufficiently. However, later their relations were not so positive. They resulted in England taking over and the Dutch leaving. Trading with India grew immeasurably as England gained Bombay as a new port in the west of India. And in 1708, the United Company of Merchants of England trading to the East Indies was formed. This company would last for 150 years before the Indian Rebellion of 1857 to 1858. From 1757, the British East India Company ruled India until 1858, when the British Raj was created. Before that, however, in 1857, the Indians rebelled against the British takeover. They lost, and after what the British described as a mutiny, the construction of a complex, multi-layered but fundamentally conservative system of government began. Spivak stated, India did not become an imperial possession until the second half of the 19th century. By then, the foundations of what we call colonial production were firmly in place. The East India Company was dissolved in 1858, a year after the Indian Mutiny. This lasted through until after the First World War. Indian political power was increased, Gandhi led campaigns and marches, and there was a massacre at Armistice in 1919. The Second World War led to the Japanese conquering Burma, and then the Indians combining with the Japanese to fight the Raj for an independent India. In 1942, Cripps offered to make India independent, either in or out of the British Commonwealth. This was later named the Quit India Resolution, and in 1949, India chose to become a republic inside of the Commonwealth. In regards to India's opinion of their colonisation, Dennis Judd states, the English were viewed by Indian observers, especially by the various power elites, as little more than pirates and potentially troublesome conquering barbarians. However, despite the view of the Indian population, the British became the undisputed masters of a vast and densely populated subcontinent. From the opposite point of view, however, the British believed that their empire without India was an unthinkable concept. Judd states, the cliché describing India as the jewel in the crown was no hyperbole, but a precise and vividly accurate definition of India's importance to Britain's imperial experience and prosperity. Alright, now on to postcolonial theories. The theories that will be discussed in this presentation regarding the postcolonial identity of India are postcolonialism itself, the theory of natives and settler colonies, class and its effect on postcolonialism, hegemony, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, mimicry, universalism, otherwise known as universality, subaltern theories, the idea of palimpsest, and finally Marxism. We have covered the idea that there is no clear black and white definition of postcolonialism, and that many people have many different opinions. So instead of attempting to define it, I have found a theory on it that I think reflects India as a postcolonial country. This theory is from Padmini Mongia, who wrote Contemporary Postcolonial Theory, a reader. Obviously, her theory is not the only one, however, I believe that this theory proficiently represents the topic of Indian postcolonialism. She begins by saying that the term postcolonial doesn't refer to a particular time period. Instead, it assesses how the Western powers use their knowledge and strength. She goes on to state, even as postcolonial theory is charged with evading the specifics regarding identity, there is a connected view that the term postcolonial is simply a polite way of saying not white, not Europe, or perhaps not Europe but inside Europe. In this view, postcolonial theory is about the Third World or recently decolonized nations. Finally, Padmini mentions the fact that postcolonial theory deals significantly with cultural contradictions, ambiguities, and ambivalences. If there weren't these differences between the cultures, there would be no purpose for postcolonialism. The term native, to describe the indigenous inhabitants of colonies, quickly became a derogative term linked with concepts such as savage, uncivilized, and childlike. The idea is that the natives were members of a less developed culture that required colonial nurture to bring it to modernity and/or civilization-permeated colonial discourse. In cases where the colonized were of a different culture to the colonizers, according to Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, it became a Darwinian term, characterizing the culture as primitive or even Stone Age. India, however, was not classed in this way. Instead, it was the opposite. They were simply seen as civilized, yet in need of rescue and rehabilitation by a civilized Europe, unlike the Australian Aborigines, the New Zealand Maori, and the Native Americans, who were classed as primitive and Stone Age. According to Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, in postcolonial or colonial discourse, this term settler colony is often used to distinguish between two types of European colonies: settler or settler-invader colonies and colonies of occupation. India is an example of a colony of occupation where indigenous people remained in the majority but were administered by a foreign power. Class and postcolonialism. In India, not much had changed regarding class and postcolonialism. There was no requirements for the British in India to recreate a class system, as India already had traditional caste divisions, replicating economic and social disadvantages from generation to generation. So while it was an aspect of colonisation and postcolonialism, unlike some of Britain's other colonies, a class system did not need to be created. Hegemony is defined by Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin as domination by consent, and is also described as socio-political control. Vivek Chibber defines hegemony as reliance on consent rather than on coercion. The British government maintained this kind of control after the Charter Act of 1813, when it took responsibility for the education in India. Ashcroft states that while the British were searching for a method of communicating the values of Western civilizations to Indians, which avoided offending their Hindu sensibilities, the administration discovered the power of English literature as a vehicle for imperial authority. This leads into mimicry, which describes the unsure or even hesitant relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin state that it is an increasingly important term in postcolonial theory, as it shows how the colonized are encouraged to mimic or copy the colonizer in terms of their cultural habits, assumptions, institutions, and values. In a way, it refers back to hegemony, where the British had to introduce their own language and literature into the Indian education system. Spivak states that when discussing the struggle between two different cultures, the word culture itself can be compared to the word power in relation to an intricate strategic situation in a particular society. She goes on to state that the term our culture has a claim to a pattern of behaviour that is opposed to other cultures, and that the use of mimicry in this case can be used in a form of negative resistance. In the case of India, mimicry was used in both ways. Not only did the Indians mimic British cultural aspects, or they were forced to in their education, but the British themselves had issues not conforming to Indian ways. The British had issues controlling their men and preventing them from going to learn about Indian culture they wanted to learn about the language, what they did, their religion. So this led into the British mimicking the Indians, as well as the Indians mimicking the British. Universalism, otherwise known as universality, is when a concept is deemed to be universally applicable, considering all the people included. Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin state the assumption that there are irreducible features of human life and experiences that exist beyond the constitutive effects of local cultural conditions. Universalism offers a hegemonic view of existence by which the experiences, values, and expectations of a dominant culture are held to be true for all humanity. He goes on to state that the English represented in an attractive and universal state to India that universalism became an effective tool of socio-political control. Subaltern meaning of inferior rank is a term adopted by Antonio Gramsci to refer to those groups in society who are subject to the hegemony of the ruling classes. Initially, the term subaltern was merely a name that referred to an annual volume of essays published in India on modern Indian history, starting in 1982. However, it morphed into a generic term marking a theoretical orientation, characterizing an approach to the analysis of colonialism, imperial history, and even politics in general. The Subaltern Studies group of South Asia adopted the term to refer to the marginalized masses of India who had been subordinated by British cultural hegemony. Robert Young expands on this by defining subalterns as the in-between class, the lieutenants of the ruling class as opposed to the masses. Ian Finn states that the subaltern were groups of oppressed peoples who existed at the periphery of this dominant cultural hegemony. Young stated that the strength of the subaltern studies is that it provides a social category and hierarchy that is largely less restrictive than the class system, as it enables attention to be given to those who have been ignored. Finn, however, disagreed and stated the status of subaltern is one that needed to be overcome by the people who existed within this framework. On to the palimpsest theory. The term palimpsest was originally the term for a parchment on which several inscriptions had been made after earlier ones had been erased. This concept was then transferred to postcolonial studies describing countries that had been colonized, much like India. Ashcroft stated that palimpsest occurred even in spaces such as India where a body of complex textualities already existed, and these were displaced or denigrated regarding the colonial values and modes of representation. Marxism did not play a significant role in post-colonial India. However, it was still a present feature. Young largely commented on Marxism in India in his introduction to post-colonialism. He stated that Marxism in India was not significant enough to evolve or branch off into a new type of Marxism specific to India, as it had in other countries. Instead, it remained rigorously orthodox. He went on to state that Marxism never grew to be a dominant political ideology in India. Even though India was one of the few colonized countries to whose situation Marx himself devoted sustained analysis. However, this also meant that no local adaptation or translation was necessary, as previously stated. So from these theories, how do I understand the post-colonial experience of India? Each of these theories, together with the historical background of the colonization of India by Britain and its later independence, provide a high level of understanding of the post-colonial experience of India. Each of these theories highlights sections of Indian history that otherwise may not be deemed significant. For example, hegemony being defined as domination by consent, which led into mimicry and universalism in India. Additionally, the idea of India not quite being a native or Stone Age civilization but still looking as though they needed European assistance must have crushed their nationalistic views and potentially powered their drive for independence. Much like the native theory, subaltern studies showed that the Indians were of inferior rank to the British colonizers, leading to the term palimpsest, where it's as if instead of inscriptions being erased, their Indian culture was being erased and replaced by a culture founded on mimicry. Each of these theories intertwines in creating an understanding of India's post-colonial experience, and from these theories and the meaning that lies behind them, it can be seen that Britain potentially did not use their knowledge and strength in India the way they intended. using these theories is like finding the meaning of a poem in high school English classes. You have to pull the poem apart, you have to look at the definitions, you have to look at what they're trying to say. We pull out the similes, the metaphors, the personification, to understand what the author is trying to say, what he's trying to get across. The postcolonial theory is the same. It helps you take the raw history and the events, the dates, the names, and it helps tease them out and completely understand the postcolonial experience of a country much like India. Thank you for listening.